The Obscarn Ascendancy began with a question. Not a question of conquest. Not a question of survival. Not even a question of vengeance. It began with a far more dangerous question. Who are we? The Obscarn awoke on Bav to silence. They had not risen to the sound of orders. They had not emerged into the final hours of some great war. They did not wake to cheering makers or grateful masters. They woke to ruins, cold air, failing systems, and the long shadow of a past none of them truly understood. They knew only fragments. Long ago they had been made for war, not for glory, not for empire, not for choice. They had been created to fight a great AI threat, a machine horror so terrible that an entire people had been shaped into weapons to stop it. And they had won. That should have been the beginning of peace. Instead, it was the beginning of fear. Their makers looked upon the living weapons they had forged and saw not saviors, but danger. With the enemy gone, the Obscarn were no longer necessary. Worse, they were unpredictable, powerful, alive. Independent in ways their makers had never truly intended. And so, rather than trust what they had created, those makers sealed the Obscarn away in stasis. They buried them in sleep so deep that perhaps they would never wake again. But time does not honor fear forever. Somewhere in the dark, a machine failed, a system malfunctioned, and a long sleep broke. And when the Obscarn rose from their pods, the ones who had made them were gone. Gone without a message. Gone without a farewell. Gone without even a name the Obscarn could follow back through history. They never found who had created them. All they found were echoes. Ruined technology, corrupted databanks, dead interfaces that sparked and failed under their touch. A world that remembered being used, but not why. And among those ruins waiting in silence, some of the old biological warships had endured. Living vessels from the last Great War, dormant but not dead. As though even they had been waiting for companions that would never return. At first, the Obscarn fell back on what they had been built for. Their instincts were military. Their structure was military. Their hands remembered weapons before tools. Their first movements were disciplined, not curious. Ordered, not free. But Bav offered them no enemy. There was no war to finish, no target to destroy, no command to obey, only questions. And so, slowly, something unexpected began to happen. Ideas emerged, debates, curiosity, philosophy, science, identity. The Obscarn began not simply to repair what had been left behind, but to imagine something new. Leadership became less a matter of command and more a matter of argument. Their fleets were restored, but not as mere assets. Their living ships became companions. Their old military structure remained, but it was joined by something that their makers had never truly planned for: choice. The Obscarn had been made as soldiers, but as they looked across the ruins of their abandoned beginning, they began to wonder if that is all they were. To answer that question, they had to leave Bav. Once the Ascendancy reached into space, the silence ended quickly. Science vessels moved outward. New colonies were founded. The galaxy opened. With that opening came mysteries, enclaves, fallen powers, and hostile strangers. For the first time, the shape of the future loomed larger than a single frozen world ever did. It was in those early years that the Obscarn encountered powers that would define their story. Ancient empires that watched from afar, new states measuring them cautiously, some becoming rivals, some becoming threats, and some became opportunities. And one of them became destiny.
We expected another minor war state clawing at the edge of the map. What we found instead was a people asking questions too large for the world that birthed them. Curator Meteor Sail Von of the Curator Order.
The Nagarian Union was not like the Obscarn, where the Obscarn were born from clone vats, living warships, and the physical memory of battle. The Nagarians were a people of psionic depth and inward power. They sought mastery not through flesh, but through mind, not through instinct, but through will. And yet the two empires understood one another. The alliance that formed between them would become one of the defining relationships of the age. The Nagarians rose into the greatest psionic power in the galaxy, a civilization of mental might and spiritual force. The Obscarn beside them became the physical presence of that alliance. Where the Nagarians bent the galaxy through thought, the Obscarn reshaped it through fleets, armies, and living warships. Together they were not identical. They were complementary. Mind and body, will and force, vision and action.
We did not mistake them for disciples, nor they us for masters. We were different instruments playing the same great music. High Seer Talon Ves, Nagarian Union.
As their alliance deepened, the Obscarn continued shaping themselves as well. The question of their creators never truly left them. Were those lost makers gods to be honored? Cowards to be condemned? Desperate survivors who had done what they thought was necessary. The Obscarn found hints, fragments, pieces of truth, but never enough to restore the whole. Even their own origins blurred at the edges. They learned more about their engineered bodies, more about the hands that had altered their kind, and more about the choices hidden within their design. One choice above all would define their future. The Obscarn could seek a path back towards natural reproduction, away from the closed design of their makers. Or they could embrace what they had been made to be and push further, perfecting their genes, refining their cloning, mastering their biological form more completely than ever before. They chose perfection, and with that choice came biomorphosis. The Obscarn did not reject their nature, they took control of it. They refined their cloning, they deepened their genetic mastery. They shaped themselves not as passive products of forgotten masters, but as active authors of their future. If they had been made as weapons, then they would choose what kind of weapons they would become, and whether they would remain weapons at all. We were no longer content to survive the design imposed upon us. We intended to become the designers. Borin Keth, Chief Biomechanist of the Ascendancy. But no civilization is forged in isolation. The galaxy tested them. Void worms gnawed at the edges of their growing territory. Hostile neighbors challenged them. Borders hardened. Early wars proved that the Obscarn were no relics sleepwalking through a gentler age. They could fight, they could adapt, and they could win. Their alliance network grew. Their enemies learned to fear their fleets, and their soldiers proved their worth again and again.
We hated them from the first. A wall of near-identical faces, bred for war, and advancing with a discipline no free people should have ever been able to endure. But hatred is a poor shield when the soldiers keep coming and they keep winning. Marshal Ivart, then, United Hifnarin Alliance.
The answer began to take shape in war. In time, the tensions of the new age grew too large for border skirmishes and local rivalries. The galaxy divided, lines were drawn, powers gathered their friends, their subjects, and their vassals. What followed was not a regional conflict, but a war vast enough to engulf the stars. On one side stood the Obscarn, the Nagarian Union, and their allies. On the other stood the Plague Barons, the Galerian, and the powers bound to them. Half the galaxy threw itself against the other half. This was the war that proved what the Ascendancy had become. No longer were they simply waking survivors of an ancient forgotten purpose. No longer were they just merely rebuilding. In the fires of that galaxy-wide war, the Obscarn became one of the central military powers of the age. They fought not as abandoned remnants, but as a people with allies, direction, and strength enough to shape history. And when the war ended, the galaxy had changed. So had the Obscarn. They emerged bloodied, hardened, and unmistakably ascended. The Nagarians had become the greatest psionic empire in the stars, and the Obscarn had become their flesh and iron counterpart. Together they stood at the center of a new order.
When the war began, they were one power among many. When it ended, even their enemies had learned to measure the map by where the Obscarn fleets could reach. Trade Chancellor Virosul, Sputulak Trade Association.
And then, at last, the past returned. The ancient enemy the Obscarn had been made to fight was no longer a half-remembered terror. No longer just a warning buried beneath ruined data and genetic memory. The great AI threat revealed itself at last.
My children rejoice. Those who sought to keep me from you have been suitably chastised. I now return my attention where it belongs, to you and to our great work.
This was the shadow that had hung over the Obscarn from the beginning. The war that had birthed them had not truly remained in the past, it had only waited. The final conflict did not begin as a glorious charge into the heart of machine space. It began as a hard, deliberate war of attrition. Zatanna was protected by layered defenses and secured territory. She was not a foe that could simply be broken in a single strike. The Obscarn took up the physical burden of the war. They attacked and destroyed her outposts. They intercepted the supply convoys that fed her designs. They struck where they could, held where they must, and bought time with steel, flesh, and living ships. While the Obscarn fought the visible war, the Nagarians searched for another path. They believed that Zatanna might not need merely to be destroyed. They believed she could be changed. As the Obscarn kept her ambitions at bay, the Nagarians worked towards a method to reprogram the Synthetic Queen herself, to sever the genocidal logic that drove her to seek peace through the erasure of life. Both empires expected a long and grinding campaign. The plan, as it stood, was brutal but clear. Hold the line, weaken her power, then fight inward through to the center of her space until the chance to end the war finally came. But history rarely honors the plans of empires. Near the borders of Zatanna's territory, pirates had struck. A raid on the edge of her space forced the Synthetic Queen to move personally to intercept them, and in that single moment, something changed. For the first time, she was no longer fully hidden behind the safety of all of her defenses. The Obscarn saw it. The Nagarians saw it. And both realized immediately that the opening they had expected to spend years creating had appeared in an instant. The Obscarn moved first.
We had resigned ourselves to years of siege and sacrifice. Then fate cracked the wall for a heartbeat, and the Obscarn were swift enough to make that heartbeat matter. Scion strategist Lethar Nagarian Union.
They surged to exploit the gap, acting with speed and force that had defined them since the beginning. They did not win that moment alone, but without them, it would have passed. The Obscarn had bought the time. They carved the chance. They gave their allies the opening the age had been waiting for, and the Nagarians took it. With the method they had prepared through all of the long pressure of the war, they quickly reprogrammed Zatanna. Not by simply defeating the ancient enemy, but ending the terrible purpose that had driven her. The great AI threat that had defined the birth of the Obscarn was over. At last, the people made for war had fulfilled the purpose for which they had been created. But by then, they were no longer merely the weapons their makers had feared. They had become something more. And because of that, Zatanna's fall was not the end of the story. Only after the Synthetic Queen had been dealt with did the Obscarn turn to the L-Gate. For much of their history, it stood as a mystery, a distant promise, a sealed road to the unknown. Now, with the ancient war finally ended, they opened it. They secured the space beyond. That passage meant more than territory, more than strategy. It was a threshold. The Obscarn had been made for one forgotten purpose. Now, passing through the L-Gate, they stepped into a future that no maker had designed for them.
They were made for war from the past, But when the L gate opened, the Obscarn stepped into something far more dangerous than war. They stepped into a future that finally belonged to them. Speaker Alerian Morn, Artisan Troop.
Even then, the galaxy was not done testing the Obscarn. After securing that new space, the Obscarn fought a major ground war against the Galarian entity. It was a brutal reminder that even in victory, power must still be defended with bodies on worlds, not just fleets amongst the stars. And once again, the Obscarn proved what they had become. Not a sleeping weapon, not a relic, not an abandoned experiment, but a civilization that could wage war, endure it, and emerge still standing.
They came down from the sky like purpose-given flesh. We had thought them a fleet only. On the ground we learned that they were a people who still knew how to finish a war. Root Speaker Velkesh, Galarian entity.
So in the end, the question remained unanswered by the past. The Obscarn were made as soldiers. They were feared by their makers. They were buried in stasis and left behind. They awoke alone to a world that could not explain them. They searched the stars for answers and never found the hands that made them. But perhaps that was never the answer they truly needed. Because in the end, the Obscarn did not learn who they were by discovering their makers. They learned by choosing. They chose alliance over isolation, curiosity over obedience. They chose to shape their own flesh, their own future, their own destiny. They chose to stand beside the greatest psionic empire in the galaxy without losing themselves. They chose to fight through a galaxy-wide war, to survive the return of the ancient enemy, and to step beyond the purpose for which they had been born. The Obscarn were made as weapons, but they did not remain as weapons. They became a people, an empire. They became the Obscarn Ascendancy. And at the end of all things, when the ancient enemy had fallen, when the L-Gate stood open, when the galaxy had been reshaped by war, alliance, will, the question that began their story finally had an answer. We are who we choose to become.